When I was a girl growing up, I was the eldest and the firstborn, and everyone said that my dad had wanted a boy so badly that even though I was a girl, he raised me as a boy, which was my good luck, because my father encouraged me to climb trees and to run and to accompany him on his races, which I'll tell you more about in a bit. So whenever we had a family get-together, all my cousins were boys, and they were larger than I was. And my father would pit me against them in wrestling matches and races and rope climbs, and I always won. And so my father would say to his brothers, my uncles, just lift her up once. And he'd say, she's not fat, but she's sturdy. And so they'd come over and pick me up, and they'd go, she's sturdy, all right. Set me back down. And my father and his brothers were notorious in southern Minnesota. They were the Noethe boys. And they worked on cars until they got them going much faster than a car was meant to go. And then they raced from Slayton to Ballatin to Tiger to New Ulm, back and forth across these empty roads. And they also got in fights in bars. But it was fist fights in those days. And so nobody was killed or brain injured or maimed. They just had quite the reputation. So my father and his brothers worked on cars. Cars were their life. Anywhere we went for a family trip or gathering, all the Noethe men would be standing around a car with its hood up, listening to the engine, telling you which carb was missing or what was misfiring. And my Uncle Jim had a 54 Ford, and he jacked with that engine until it went 125 miles an hour. This is in the 50s. So he was telling me about one night he was racing in that car, and he also had a bottle of open whiskey. And he was clocked by the highway patrol going 125 miles an hour through this small town. And so he went to court, and the judge was a woman. And she said, they clocked you in a 54 Ford going 125 miles an hour? And my Uncle Jim said, that's what they claim. And she said, I have a 54 Ford. That pig won't go over 60. Case dismissed. Then my brother Ben, my dad's brother Ben, had been bothered by a highway patrolman. He knew these guys were racing. And so by Lake Benton, the road makes a deep curve around the lake. And at night, if someone is chasing someone, they have to see that person hit the brakes so they know that there's the deep curve and not slow down. Well, my Uncle Ben jimmied the brake switch so that when he hit the brakes, the brake lights didn't work. So one night he was being chased by the highway patrolman, and he slowed down for the curve, and the highway patrolman drove right into Lake Benton. And they talked about this stuff, and I wished I'd written it down and taped it because it was so funny. There was so much of it. So my father took me along whenever he raced with his brothers. We'd go down home to southern Minnesota. And my father and his brothers would lay underneath the weeping willows. And they had their cigarettes rolled in their T-shirts, and they had pompadour rolls. And my dad could do push-ups standing on his hands or with me on his back. And they'd lay in the grass beneath the willows and the aspen of southern Minnesota and talk. And I'd lay with my ear on my father's chest and listen to his heart and his voice. Then it was time to go racing. And so my dad took me along. And this is pre-seatbelt laws. And I was small enough that I could stand on the seat next to my dad. And he would hold his arm out like this while he raced, and I would shout off the numbers on the odometer, how fast we were going. And so I believe that had there been a terrible crash, I would not have thrown through the windshield. But my father's arm would have kept me there safe. I truly believe that. So when we got back to where the rest of the group was, my mother and the women said, why do you always go off with the men? And I said, they buy me cherry cokes at the Chat and Chew, which is a local cafe. They never found out that I was racing with those men. And I like to go fast in everything, though. It's not just cars. I like to go fast. Well, when my father passed this January 31st, 5 days after his 85th birthday, his body flew from his soul soundlessly and instantly. And I went back home to prepare for the funeral, and I got to be a pallbearer. Well, I insisted, because I'd never seen a woman pallbearer before. And I was going through his dresser drawers, and I found the chrome insignia of a cougar from one of those cars in the late 50s and 60s that he had raced in with his brothers. And I brought it back home, and I got it tattooed onto my calf. So my leg is now a memorial to my father. My father would tell me that I would never walk behind a man, only beside one. And when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, if we'd bought something defective, he would send me in to return it or replace it, because he said, you've got to speak up for yourself. You've got to be strong. So when I was in, I think, 4th grade, there was a boy on the playground that used to bully us. And there were a number of boys that used to bully the girls as they walked home. And so I became their bouncer. And I would walk with those girls, and when the boys started throwing things or chasing us, I would just deck them. So I was frequently in the principal's office for having beaten some boys. The only time that I didn't win, the boy's friends held me down, and the boy kissed me. And that was worse than if he'd hit me with a brick. And I was on the playground, and this kid showed up on his bike, and he pretended to ride into me, to crash into my legs. And he wouldn't leave me alone, and he was bullying me verbally, and he was threatening me. So I took care of him, and then I went home, and I said, Dad, you may get a call from this kid, from his dad, because, well, I took his bike apart for him. And my dad said, no man of any son is going to call the father of a girl and say, your girl wrecked my boy's bike because he was picking on her. And my dad was right. Never happened. I distinctly remember when I was maybe 13, my father came out into the yard and pulled me out of a tree and said, you have to go in and learn from the women now. And I resisted that hugely. I didn't want to cook. I didn't want to clean up after men. When there were holidays, the women would prepare a big dinner, and then the men would either go lay under the willows or they'd watch sports, and the women would clean up, and I would have none of it. It would have nothing to do with that. So there were many arguments about gender roles. And when I was in 10th grade, I discovered the women's liberation movement. And I said, this is what I've been looking for all my life. I read that the status of the woman is the creation of the first class system. And woman is the bottom, and then man is the superior. And that's how all the classism and the hegemony of wealth and poverty is based on. So my friends and I, who really adapted to this idea, when we were 13 and 14, we went to the boys' health classes to speak about women's liberation, which was really naive, really crazy. And the only answer I had back from the bombardment of insults from the boys in the class was, you could just marry a black widow spider. Or is it a walking stick, the one that has sex with her mate and then eats him? But I attribute my father with making me brave and strong and to say my piece. So my first book of poetry, when it was published, had a poem in it called The Noethe Boys. And it was about them fighting racing cars, about how everybody's house in southern Minnesota, in the backyard, there were bathtubs and water heaters and old car bodies with mice living in the seats. And that kind of rural view is something, wherever I go, if I can see rusting body parts of cars, stuff spreading out, lots of leafy trees, green, I'm at home. I'm comforted, I'm safe. My father particularly loved cougars, and he would get tickets from the city for running a junk lot because he had so many cougars he would take apart and reassemble until he had a car that worked. So when my book was published, I brought the book home and I showed my dad the poem, and his eyes filled with tears, and he looked up at me and he said, "By golly, honey." That's all he ever said, but it meant everything to me. So when he passed, I did not weep because I had told him everything I needed to tell him. Over the years, I told him many times that he was my masculine ideal and that I was able to pick my very fine husband because he had the qualities of my father. And so when my father came to Missoula to visit, he would sit in the backyard, and our backyard is Mount Jumbo, and he would watch the deer. And he would sit out there watching those deer and drinking cup after cup of coffee. And I would come out in the dark and he'd be shaking from the cold. And I'd say, "Dad, come on, you got to come in, you're shaking." And he would say, "I know they're there. I can sense them. They're moving about on the hills." So the week after he died, 4 deer walked repeatedly up and down the street in front of our house. One lagged behind and looked at me like it was trying to figure something. And then the others would sprint off and it would follow. But for 4 nights, these 4 deers and the one laggard walked down Harrison Street, and the one stopped and tried to remember how he knew me. And so that's how Hinduism has helped me with the loss of my father, because I can love him in all things that he loved. My grandmothers were both dead before I was born. One of them died in childbirth with her 8th. She was 4'8". After the 5th child, the doctor told her she would not survive another birth. And my mother would say, and then would come out that old horrible polka dot maternity blouse, and we knew another mouth to feed when there already wasn't enough. Well, it killed her. And my grandfather, her husband, was a drunk. And my mother said that when he came roaring home from town at night, the kids climbed out of the back windows of the house, and hid in the cornfield because they were so afraid of him. When my grandmother, who died at 30, broke her arm, he said there wasn't money for a doctor. And so some wealthier cousins were driving past, and they saw my grandmother with one hand held against her with the bone sticking out, hanging clothes up on the line with the hand that worked. And they took her into town. But that gives you the idea of the kind of life she had. And she died at 30. My father's mother also died at 30. She also had 8 children, but she died of breast cancer. And again, there was no money for a doctor. So I missed having a grandma, really terribly. And I always sought out gentle old grandmas with white hair to love and be loved by and to be comforted by. But I feel inside of me the cells of the 2 women, Tilda and Anna, the 2 dead grandmothers. I feel them stretching inside of my cells to do everything they could not. So when I was 17, I went to Spain alone. I went to Africa alone. Wasn't easy, wasn't pretty, but I did it. And if there's ever a question about an experience or an adventure, I feel Anna and Tilda inside of me just stretching and wanting to know and wanting to see and experience and be. I believe in the collective memory or racial memory, and that all of human consciousness is collected and stored within each of us. But we forget. When we're infants and we start to learn to speak the language and behave like citizens, we forget. And I think that I was slightly improperly socialized because I feel them, I remember them, and they inspire me to be and to do. And so I break the rules of my family. I moved out of the house at age 15, working as a bus girl, rented a room in a boarding house. From there on, it was on to new things. And I scrabbled in the streets to survive for a long time. But I was strong and courageous, and I had those two women's lives to make up for. And so I've had great adventures. And I've done things no one on either side of the family has ever done. I've traveled the world, and I've written 5 books, and I've taught at a university, and I speak 3 or 4 languages. And it's because of what they missed out and what they lacked that I had to achieve these things. And so I'm dedicating this story to the 2 women who only lived 30 years, whom I never met, but who I carry within me as inspiration and fearlessness and hard-headedness.